Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller and the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're pleased to welcome David Potter to our At Home with Literati series in support of disruption and in conversation this evening with Juan Cole. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be sharing links to purchase Disruption from Literati throughout the event. You can use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and I will ask a selection at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. Live transcription is available to you on your toolbar as well. And of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, links to purchase the book are available right below me in the description below. You can also subscribe to stay in touch with our future events as well. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And of course, if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. David Potter is Francis W. Kelsey Collegiate Professor of Greek and Roman History and Arthur F. Thurnau Professor at the University of Michigan. His previous books include The Origin of Empire, Rome from the Republic to Hadrian, Constantine the Emperor, The Victor's Crown, A History of Ancient Sport from Homer to Byzantium, and Theodora, Actress, Empress, Saint. Speaking with him this evening, Juan Cole is a public intellectual, prominent blogger, and essayist, and the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He is the translator of Broken Wings and The Vision by Khalil Gibran. Please join me in welcoming David Potter and Juan Cole into your living rooms.
Well, thank you very much for having us. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I feel the same way. Literati is a special place, and it's wonderful to talk about books under that auspices.
Absolutely. It's a real centerpiece of our community.
So, David,
yes.
You have written a very wide-ranging book that I have to say was a real pleasure to read. Congratulations on managing to draw a long bow, but also to do it in a way that I think the readers will enjoy, will delight in. And your central organizing principle is, you say, not exactly revolutions in history, because you have a problem with that particular term, but what you call disruption. So I guess first order of business is anytime one talks to an author is you want to know what was the person trying to accomplish here? What was the central idea that drove this piece of writing?
Well, I started thinking about this in 2017 after Charlottesville. And I started asking, what is going on that we seem to be losing faith in the central institutions of our society. And of course, looking across the ocean at Brexit, looking at the rise of the National Front, or Viktor Orban, I made a question, what is going on here and why? And when have we seen this before? I mean, as historians, it's useful to be able to use the past to sort of think about the present, to sort of say, what is this like or not like? And so I began to think about periods of really radical change, both very positive and negative, because when you've lost faith in your central institution, that is very often what's going to happen. And to try to think about this in different ways, that a disruption is a change that you can't come back from. And that is different from the way we use revolution, which is, it can be just about anything. But looking at these fundamental kinds of changes, asking what do they have in common when they work? What do they have in common when they fail or go off in directions that you couldn't possibly imagine? And the other thing that really struck me is that the ideas that drive these disruptions really emerge from way outside the mainstream. I mean, you couldn't be much further outside the mainstream of the Roman Empire than being a Christian. As you know from your wonderful book on Muhammad, liberally used in my section on the rise of Islam, again, Muhammad is an extraordinary figure in Arabian society. Martin Luther, again, these ideas may be out there, but he's the one who pulls them together in opposition to the extraordinary power of the Catholic Church. The idea that you could actually base a society on the consent of the governed, again, is a pretty crazy idea up until the latter part of the 18th century. And then the ideas at the end, again, Karl Marx is sitting in the British Library, which isn't necessarily, the center of intellectual life in Europe at the time. He's very much a marginal figure. So just trying to see, how do these ideas suddenly become central? What enables them, creates the space for that?
Yeah, it's another thing that's striking about your approach is that you emphasize that not only are there these moments when a previously marginal set of ideas comes to the fore, but also when they do so, you see a tendency, a kind of ratcheting action that people attached to those ideas want to take them ever further, the direction of history at that point tells against a counter-revolution or going back to the old ways, because in a way the new orthodoxies, having been marginal before and now becoming central, have to defend themselves against ideas and movements which are to their left or even more revolutionary than they are.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think one of the classic models for that really was the Protestant Reformation, where we can see Luther saying, okay, we're going here, no more purgatory, God's grace is salvation, but we're not going over here with the rebaptizing group. Calvin is way too far off for me. He really said, if I'm going to be able to deal with the people who are going to provide the support that I need, we're going to have to keep it within certain limits. And I think the same thing you can say was true in this country in the 1780s, that they were taking a really radical set of ideas that they used to promote a revolution against a strong central government to suddenly shape a new government. But when you lose any sense of where the boundaries are, I think at exactly the same time, when we turn to France and look at how the center disappeared in French politics and fell victim to Robespierre, and did so very rapidly. And that's the other thing, is that so often the events move so quickly that it's very hard to perceive what is going on. I mean, obviously Lenin hadn't lived in Russia for more than a decade. He gets off a train in the spring, and a few months later, he's overthrown the provisional government. The extraordinarily sudden rise of Nazism as well. I mean, Hindenburg, who I suppose rates as the poorest prophet of any of the people in this book, thinking I can just control this person. I think social snobbery in his way. But before 6 months are out, he suddenly installed the Nazi dictatorship.
Yeah, let me zero in a little bit on some of the chapters, which are very rich, and I admire your storytelling abilities. I think it's one of the wonderful things about academic history is that we can still speak to the public. We can still write for a lay audience in a way that I think some of our colleagues in the social sciences have gone so far towards calculus that they become a little inaccessible. So you write very clearly, and you attend, although the book is very much a book of ideas, you attend very carefully also to social history and to the ways in which, as you say, there are limits on the march of ideas that are deriving from the classes that are powerful, the classes that are aspiring and rising. With regard to Constantine, about which you were among the world experts, having written a whole book on him, you challenge a lot of our common conceptions about Constantine, which I think we all learn in church, or those of us who were brought up church-going learn in church. I wonder if you would go into that a little bit for us. Is what do we think we know about Constantine that we just get completely wrong?
Right. Well, there are two ways of writing about Constantine. You can either start at the end of his life with Eusebius's biography, or you can start with the sources that were written at various earlier points in his life. And my approach to Constantine has always been to write about Constantine from front to back, not back to front, which was really the dominant way of thinking about him in the past. I mean, the basic book on Constantine that I grew up with was entitled Eusebius and Constantine. But Eusebius's biography of Constantine was written with a very specific agenda, that he was a bishop and he was going to make Constantine look as much like an aspiring bishop as he possibly could. And there are all kinds of gray areas in Constantine's life that Eusebius, who didn't know him very well, didn't know very much about. The most important of which was how he became a Christian. And so he invented the story of the cross and the sky and all of that. Probably never even read the really critical document, which was a letter that Constantine wrote to a council of bishops in 314, in which he explains how he was converted, that he was searching in his own mind for ways to become a better person. And he met the great God who stands on the watchtower of heaven, who showed him how to be a better guy. But also, as we can see from other documents from Constantine's own time, his own understanding of Christianity was always evolving. I think my favorite Constantinian text, well, maybe two of them. One is when he goes into a meeting with his soldiers and they all get up and say, "Gods, plural, preserve you, Constantine." And this is 10 years after 312, when he converted. And the other is after lightning struck the palace and he sends an order to the prefect of Rome, said, "Okay, guys, call in the haruspices and make sure there's nothing wrong here." I mean, he never really got the monotheist completely, but he also believed very firmly that the Christian God brought him victories that wouldn't have been possible in any other way. That he knew that the greatest soldier of the previous generation, Galerius, had failed miserably invading Italy. And in 312, he's looking for a new God, a new way that will guide him to victory. And who is the most improbable God you can find is the one that Galerius hated the most. So there's a lot going on here. But he also surrounds himself with a few bishops who guide him in his progress to becoming a Christian over time. And so that's a gradual development of Constantine as a Christian, and then his sense of how to develop the Christian church into a central institution of the empire.
So the 19th century German specialist in religions, Max Müller, developed this notion from studying Hinduism, actually, of henotheism, that there's something that's not straight polytheism and not straight monotheism, but systems that allow for multiple manifestations of the divine, but which for one reason or another focus in on one of them as central to the cult. And there's some thinking that, it's no accident that in the Hebrew Bible, one of the words for God is Elohim. This is the plural. There seems to be a council of gods around the one God in the earliest chapters of the Bible, and that's maybe a stage of Judaism where they were still henotheistic. But would it be fair to suggest that Constantine, at least earlier on, was more of a henotheist than a monotheist?
Absolutely, absolutely. But his God was the best God, but not the only God.
Yeah. Well, it's been argued that the Roman Empire, once it adopted Christianity as the state religion, which is something that really happens after Constantine, as I understand it, doesn't so much persecute paganism into non-existence as it just pulls the plug on the funding.
That's absolutely right. And I think that one of the things that Constantine really understood, because he'd grown up in the court of Diocletian, he'd watched the persecution unleashed in 303, he'd seen how unsuccessful it was in Diocletian's lifetime, that he knew that you cannot force people to change what they believe in. What you can do is convince them that there's another idea that might be better. But if you try to compel something, you simply get people's backs up. And he closes a couple of temples, but those are places which are major oracular centers, or where there's temple prostitution, and that there are very specific reasons to do this. I mean, half the people in his administration at the time he died were still pagans.
Yeah. So I think there's a kind of implicit argument in your book, and we'll come on to the other chapters and ideas as well. But I think there's an implicit idea in your book also that these moments of disruption where a new social, political, economic reality comes to dominate are also susceptible to becoming rigid and in some ways being undone in subsequent generations. Everything you just said about Constantine's attitude towards religions in the empire seems to me the opposite of the views held by Justinian, the husband of Theodora, whom you wrote about, and that he really seems to have thought, and you mention in your book in the chapter on Islam about Heraclius, by that time in the 500s and 600s, the Christian Roman Empire emperors really do seem to think that they can impose religion on people.
That's absolutely right. And that, as you say, the shift from the progressive moment of these ideas to the regressive moment is a very significant one, but it is also one that routinely happens. And yeah, I mean, I think Heraclius, his narrow-minded Chalcedonianism undermined the victory that he'd won over the Persians. He managed to alienate all of the subjects that he just brought back into the empire, and he combines that with marrying his niece and ordering a persecution of the Jewish population of the empire. I mean, you were a lot better off being Jewish in Muhammad's Arabia than you were being in Heraclius's Roman Empire. And the thing that I found, I thought I hadn't thought of before in writing the book is just how Heraclius and Charles V in the time of the Reformation, both are very similar kinds of self-destructive figures. You know, they're narrow-minded. They don't ask themselves what their subjects are thinking. They simply try to tell people, I'm the emperor, and now you're going to do what I told you to do.
Yeah.
And
Please.
sorry, and I say with Heraclius, not even being able to think, my empire has just been through a quarter century of warfare, coming at the end of a period of terrible destruction and ecological disaster. Maybe the thing to do is to try to bring people together. It never occurs to him. I mean, this is a man, like certain more recent politicians, who's the hero in his own story when he makes it up.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to your chapter on Islam, which I liked very much, and I like.
Got a great deal of influence on.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to see. There's been a wonderful dialogue happening between people interested in the rise of Islam and classicists. Who, when I was a graduate student back in the Jurassic, that combination really didn't exist very much. I think the Islamicists didn't attend very much to what the classicists were doing. This was before the influence of Peter Brown and a shift of focus to the 500s and 600s, so that a lot of classicists, I think, really admired the Roman Republic and thought of the late Roman Empire, the transition to the Byzantines, as kind of decadent and hidebound and not very interesting. So it's the credit of your generation of classicists to excavate a lot of that for us. But I think you make a compelling case that you can't really understand the phenomenon. Maybe not so much of Muhammad himself, who had this West Arabian initial context, but the phenomenon of the rise of Islam in the southern half of the former Roman Empire, without looking at this connection between these two spheres of the ancient world.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, at the time we're talking about, there's a very active dialogue that's going on, and there has been for a very long period of time. And as you say, Muhammad is looking north at the Roman and Persian empires. This is the world in which he grew up. That to try to take these in isolation just doesn't seem to me to make any sense, any more than when we talk about earlier periods of Roman history. We have to be aware that this is the whole Mediterranean world that we're talking about. That it's a world that extends from the Nile Valley to the Hadrian's Wall. And there's probably no better illustration of this, more powerful symbol of this, a wonderful glass cup found at Vindolanda, which shows us an African gladiator who was clearly a star in the area. So somebody painted him on a very fancy cup. But it's this dialogue on the fringe of empire that I think has been one of the most important things that we've seen over the years.
It struck me, you don't say this in your book, but it struck me that there's a lot of similarity between your account of Muhammad and your account of Luther.
I think that that's right. There's a sense of a very independent person who has a series of very deeply held ideas, who's extremely persuasive to the people around him, and shapes a new community through the force of his personality. So yeah, I do think that there's a great deal to be said. I think Muhammad was probably a bit easier to get on with than Luther was.
I think that's probably right. Well, it also struck me that in both cases, there was a kind of Christianity had become the establishment, which had become deeply unpopular for various reasons among the Christians.
Yes.
You talk about the indulgences and the kind of rising taxation on the notable classes and in the era of Luther. And in Muhammad's time also, I think, as you say, Heraclius's instinct to come back into the Near East after having lost it to the Iranians for 25 years, not with imploring of the locals to please come back to Constantinople and switch their allegiances back and so forth, but with the sword. You guys are heretics and you'd better shape up. That in a way that was a similar reaction to the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which met Luther's ideas with anathemas and inquisition.
Exactly. Though I think that Luther had also the advantage that he understood the printing press an awful lot better than the Catholic hierarchy, and his sense. But this is again a radical thinker who's thinking about how to do things in radically different ways, and he understands that producing short works in German explaining his ideas to the people around him, as opposed to sort of the traditional, you are wrong, we will now have a procession through the city to curse you, the sort of thing. That part of the excitement of Luther, I think, is just the modernism of it all. I mean, in the same way it was, I think, with Muhammad, that this is new, this is different, this is original. And that's being put up against an very old-fashioned orthodoxy. And the same as on the Persian side in the Near East, here is a Zoroastrian orthodoxy which doesn't speak to a whole lot of people at this point. And when you get to the beginning of the 16th century, there have been plenty of critics of the Catholic establishment, of extremely self-indulgent clergy. Erasmus of Rotterdam, his satires on all of this, it sort of lays the groundwork in a way for Luther to take everything in a much more radical direction.
You have an approach which I think is very interesting and keeps the reader's attention of taking several different points of view on some of these disruptions. And so you're interested with regard to the American Revolution, with its British and other European, French and other European background. One thing I noticed, I was just wanting to ask you about this. It's not a criticism really, but there's a tradition of writing about the American Revolution from the point of view of legal history and history of ideas that looks for past republics.
Yes.
And so, some of the great work starts with Venice. But you don't seem very interested in this book, at least, in that kind of genealogy. And I just wondered why.
It's because I quite honestly didn't really see it in the reading lists. When you read, you read through Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu, it's not really there, and that's primarily what the people were reading. You read the Federalist Papers, it's a relatively limited reading list, and an awful lot of it is classical. And going back to Calvin, reinterpretations of the Roman Republic as an organization that threw out kings, and then the gradual working with various, especially Cicero, because it's easier in Latin than Greek. But that this all seems to me to be a much more powerful strand in the thinking behind the active thinkers. I mean, this isn't to deny the relevance of another way of looking at the ideas of republics, but for the actors that in the 1780s and 1790s, I thought that, just in terms of what they were reading and they were seeing, that's where I should concentrate attention.
Yeah, well, that's a powerful point. And it's something that I've noticed myself reading the Enlightenment era thinkers, is how immersed they were in the classical world, to the point where I think sometimes we non-classicists probably can't entirely understand what they're driving at, because they have in mind some incident or some set of political configurations that they were taught in school in Latin or Greek, and they allude to it, you know, in a way that we'd have to go and do a PhD thesis to recover that kind of knowledge.
No, that's absolutely right. And also there's a certain amount of debate back and forth with each other in terms of their own reading of these texts. And, you know, I often thought as I was reading this, how appalled Cicero might have been to see that he was an actual major figure in creating ideas of popular power, which he spent most of his political career opposing to the best that he could. But if you throw out the speech and you read the laws in the Republic, which is what Hobbes and Locke and they really knew extremely well, and you read Aristotle and Plato on the side, yes, you are arguing back and forth, not entirely unlike some classicists from time to time, through the same bibliography.
Yeah.
But the other thing I think is really interesting is how you can see in the course of the 17th and the 18th century that ideologically it's critical to use classical authors because they're your alternative authority figures to the church. So again, in terms of the going outside the establishment to bring these authors in and to turn them into the core of the discussion is, again, intellectually, I think, a really quite radical act.
Yeah, I think that the Enlightenment thinkers often, had this not always open enmity with church orthodoxy. And you see it in Locke, you see it in Jefferson. When Locke writes about magistrates, he means religious authorities. You can just hear the venom, and I think that their emphasis on freedom of thought, freedom of religion, was another cudgel that they wielded to escape the dominance of the church. So Locke actually appears to me to have acknowledged the right of Muslims to their faith.
Mm-hmm.
His only concern was that they shouldn't have a political allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan. That is to say, if you could privatize Islam, if it weren't a matter of an alternative political allegiance, then why would it be different than to have Anglicans worshiping? And I think also for Jefferson, Islam plays this role. He famously said that why would he care if his neighbor worshiped one god or 1,000 gods? It doesn't pick his pocket. And apparently, in the law on religious toleration that Jefferson and Madison got passed in Virginia, which is one of the backgrounds for our First Amendment, there was a party of conservatives and evangelicals, Patrick Henry amongst them, who were afraid that if you had a statute on religious freedom in Virginia, that it would authorize the practice of Islam. And I don't know if they understood that some proportion, 10–20% of their slaves probably were Muslims. But Jefferson, by that time, was in Paris. Madison wrote him and told him that it had gotten passed. And I can't tell you how joyous Jefferson was that those people who opposed it were shown not to have been persuasive in the legislature.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think religious and political freedom go hand in hand in their views, and is a critical feature of the thought of this period. I mean, another person, of course, who Jefferson knew well was Montesquieu. And so much of Montesquieu's writing is to break down a monolithic notion that there is one religion that works. He's very sympathetic to Islam. And I think really, when you look at the middle of the 18th century, you're seeing a great opening up of thought on the radical left to all kinds of different religions. And it's really important to be able to say there's not one truth here.
Yeah. And in the same way that you attend to these subsequent moments of undoing or of in a way, counter-revolution, I think you're suggesting that slavery was the Achilles heel of this Enlightenment thought.
Yes, absolutely.
This is illegal in some states, David.
Well, I think the problem that you had was that the framers of the Constitution needed a constitution, and they were willing to compromise on the issue of slavery. I don't think it's entirely clear to me whether a number of them also believed it would just go away. I mean, it's striking, of course, that as in the French Revolution, slavery is abolished immediately. It's reimposed by Napoleon. But the illogic of claiming that you're a democratic society and having slavery was obvious in France, and I think it was probably obvious to quite a number of people, but that they didn't have a way of dealing with it, and that they sort of kicked the can down the road, saying that, that those who thought that it would go away, it'll go away. And they did not understand, again, in a way, that the institutionalization of slavery in American politics in the next few generations.
So we're coming to the end of our time for my questions. I'm hoping the audience has been inspired to a lot of them themselves, but let's turn to your in a way, I think we're coming back to the moment that inspired you to write the book with your treatment of Spencer and of the rise of European fascism in particular. Is it, maybe I misread you, but I read you to see a genealogy of social Darwinism feeding into later fascist conceptions of racial hierarchy. Did I read you right?
You read me absolutely correctly. Because this idea of you have to fight your way to the position of being the top nation and the top people is wrapped up with eugenics. And Darwin was a scientist. He couldn't stand what Galton was doing. And that's where, it always seems to be terribly unfair to call this social Darwinism, because the least social Darwinist person you could find would have been Charles Darwin. But Herbert Spencer and Galton perverted these ideas into a pseudoscience that you can see pervading thought in the United States in the turn of the 20th century into the 1920s, the passing of eugenics legislation here, the restrictions on immigration that were characteristic of American politics in the 1920s. As Hitler is rising to power, he doesn't sound that different from a lot of other right-wing politicians who are spewing the same kind of social Darwinist, eugenicist agendas. And I think that it is a critically important point that when we think about how Nazism came to power, it came to power because it was not recognized as being radically different from a lot of other conservative thought. And I mean, even where Hitler says he's taking notes on the eugenics legislation from American states. Okay, probably it's a lie because he couldn't read English, but it still should be a real reminder to us that this of the very wide spectrum of these ideas.
Yeah, as I understand it, the 1924 Immigration Act in the United States, which closed off the great wave of immigration that had begun in the 1870s and lasted until the early 20s, and which brought, well, let us say non-Protestants to the United States in large numbers, Poles and Italians and Jews, of course.
Yep.
And not only were these peoples thought by some in the white Protestant establishment to be lesser races, and that's the way they would talk. Of course, the Irish, when they first came to Boston, were actually called black. So these hierarchies were imposed on them by the establishment. And so that 1924 Immigration Act intended to close off that source of immigration, and it set quotas for countries by which they meant races based on the period before that wave. So they were trying to recreate the 1850s America, in which most immigration had been German and Northern European and Swedish, and that's what they wanted. And I understand that that there were Nazis who did know English and who read that legislation and who were inspired by it. So the Americans often, I think, have an overly rosy view of their own history in these regards, and I think Germany was something peculiar. But there was a lot of dialogue on these issues.
Oh, that's absolutely right, and I hope that comes out very clearly in the discussion that Hitler is an aberrant form of ideas that are already out there and shared quite widely, and sadly, these are ideas that have not gone away.
No, I'm afraid some of them may have been in the White House recently.
Yes.
Well, I've been instructed to bring our discussion to a close and open things up. It's a rich book, and I'm hoping we'll have a further possibility of dialoguing with you, David. Thank you so much for this conversation and for the book.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Juan. It's a pleasure always to talk to you.
We don't have any questions from the audience just yet. So this is my opportunity to remind our guests this evening that if you would like to submit a question for David, I will ask it on your behalf. You can do so using the Q&A feature that's on your toolbar. But Juan, if you had questions that were on the cutting room floor or some other ideas you wanted to press David on, please feel free to continue, and I will return with questions from our audience or to wrap up the evening.
Well, there's no shortage of ideas in this book. I'm sure we can go on talking about it, and in an interesting way for a long time. But you don't mention much about Aryan theory in particular, which my friend and colleague Tom Troutman, having been an India specialist, turned the tables and went and wrote about the rise of Aryan theory in Britain. But you don't name that particular variant of this racial superiority.
No, I didn't. I think because at that point I was primarily concentrating on Galton. And I thought that there's a sense in which the theory of the Aryan descends from Galton's eugenic theory. And if I had taken the time to list all the really awful ideas that sprang from that, there would have been it would have taken a lot more time. But I mean, in his writing, when he decides he doesn't know anything about history, but he's drawing historical analogies and making statements based on his own bad understanding. This proves my scientific theory is right. It's just an appalling sort of reasoning, and that, again, that it should start moving its way into a legislative program is, I think, a lesson to us all on, in these cases, how really bad ideas, from the fringes start shaping mainstream thought because they latch on to other prejudices which are in the society.
You're towards the end of the book, you are interested with regard to the rise of the National Socialists and the imposition of a kind of hierarchy, an orthodoxy of racial hierarchy. You're interested in some of the roots of that in World War I. And in what I think most of us who look back on that period think of as a set of crazy presuppositions and schemes and notions that drove that disaster and led to subsequent disasters.
Yes, well, I think when you look at this notion that, first of all, people didn't understand how well their own weapons actually worked. Secondly, that they all had a fantasy that if they went to war, it would all be over within a few months, that they didn't understand. I mean, the key to warfare is logistics. And the people who understood this were being ignored by the politicians. I'm sure that von Moltke really knew that the Schleifenplan couldn't work because you couldn't get people to march that fast and eat over that distance.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just wonder if for some in the audience who may not know those details, if you would explain a little bit what you mean by logistics and the Schleifenplan.
Okay, yes, obviously, when the Germans decided to go to war, they did so with a plan which assumed that they could knock out France very rapidly and then turn and destroy Russia, because the Germans had planned all along for a two-front war. The problem was that where it looks wonderful on a map, you can draw all these lines and say, we can move all these people very quickly into France and we'll destroy the French. It was logistically impossible to do that. You couldn't keep the food up with the soldiers. You couldn't keep the ammunition up with the soldiers, which meant ultimately that, although not very well managed on their own part, the French were able to rally and force a stalemate on the Western Front. At the same time, in the East, very destructively, the Russian armies that were sent into Germany were completely badly supplied. They didn't have enough shells for their artillery to fire. They didn't have enough bullets for their infantry. You had a government that basically sent its own army to its own destruction because it refused to listen to its own officers saying that we cannot make this work. And there's a wonderful memorandum written by a former Russian interior minister named Dernovo, who spelled this all out absolutely perfectly for the Tsar. And he was cashiered and ignored. But he also added the fact that if you lose another war, you're going to promote enormous social unrest, which was exactly what happened, of course. And the Tsarist regime was tremendously self-undermining and had been for well over a decade prior to the war. But it's, again, a failure of government on all sides to understand their own weaknesses and their own limitations, because they're driven by an ideology of how do you become the best nation, that you have to compete, you have to win the struggle. And this is, I think, we really see driving the actions in the summer of 1914. And I think that the really good recent work on the outbreak of the First World War has really brought out the fact, the personal responsibilities for the errors that were made and the assumptions that were the faulty assumptions that were being made.
So you explained the genesis of this book in the events of 2016, 2017 in your own mind. I wonder if we could go back and get a sense from you, given that you're by profession a classicist, and most of your books have focused on that period. You've been wide-ranging as a classicist, but you clearly have an interest in world history far beyond your own turf, and have read widely and deeply in it. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what drives that interest, how it came about, how you maintain it. We're all I'm amazed that you could write a book like this. So I feel like all of us in academia are under pressure to write more specialized journal articles in our own field. And how is it that you spread your wings in this way?
Well, I think that the great advantage thing that I've been able to do here is teach a number of very large lecture courses to a large audience, which means that you really have to try to draw connections between the ancient world and the modern world. We have to be able to speak to our students. And in the years of teaching courses on Greek and Roman sport, or on warfare and antiquity, I've always tried to show students how that relates to the world that we're living in now. So I think that it's really been the opportunity to teach here over the years that's enabled me to continue to try to explore history in different periods. And when I was, again, starting out in this, in the business, one of the advantages of being in Oxford was that you were in an automatically interdisciplinary community. And I had the opportunity to get to know some really wonderful early modern historians who showed me ways that I could think about writing about the Roman world and questions that I could ask of Roman evidence that weren't perhaps immediately obvious coming out of a classical bibliography. So it's really been that aspect throughout my career that I think has helped me write a book like this.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and so I'd just like this opportunity to thank David Potter and Juan Cole for joining us this evening on At Home with Literati. Of course, you can purchase Disruption from our store. If you're in Ann Arbor or Southeast Michigan, you can walk on in, but of course there's a link in the chat. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there's also links in the description as well. David and Juan, thank you so much for joining us this evening. To all of our viewers, thank you for joining us as well. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Take care all.